When you look at the coast of Georgia, seemingly nothing remains of the 16th century and its rich Catholic past. But just below the surface lies evidence of a vibrant missionary effort. Palm trees arranged in the outline of a church, ancient artifacts undeniably Catholic preserved in museums, and even Franciscan friars serving a thriving Catholic community today with missionary zeal. All of this exists on the very soil Franciscan missionaries walked on 400 years ago, as they endeavored to bring the gospel to native peoples in what was then the northernmost reaches of Spanish La Florida. In 1597, 5 of these friars would give their lives, martyred for the faith. This is the story of the Georgia Martyrs. Hello, I'm Father Pablo Migoni, and I'm the Chancellor of the Diocese of Savannah. In 1492, Christopher Columbus made his first voyage to what would become known as the New World. And in 1733, Georgia was founded as a British colony. But between those dates, there is a rich history of people: Spanish colonials, Franciscan friars, and native tribes living in Spanish La Florida. First claimed by Spain in 1513, the next 50 years of Spanish history saw several failed attempts at colonization. It was only after the French showed an interest in the area that the Spanish resolved to hold the peninsula in order to protect the treasure fleets sailing up the eastern seaboard as they returned to Spain from Mexico and Peru. Pedro Menendez, the first governor of Florida, founded St. Augustine in 1565. To better understand the missions and dynamics of the period, we talked to Dr. David Hurst Thomas, curator of North American archaeology at the American Museum of Natural History.
Menendez signed a contract that required he take care of the souls of the indigenous people who were already there. And he was also required right at first to bring in this new religious order. The King of Spain required that he bring in Jesuits. And the Jesuit order was only found 30 years before St. Augustine. This was their very first enterprise, missionary enterprise. And it was a bust all the way around. It lasted 6 years. The Jesuit imperative required such obedience that they just found the Indians couldn't do it. They found the landscape was undesirable, and so they were withdrawn 6 years into the process. Now, Menendez still had a contract that required they missionize the indigenous people, so he turned to the Franciscan order, there were something like 22,000 Franciscans by then, and they had a missionary endeavor that all over the world, including Asia, that goes back into the 1300s. So they were a known commodity. They knew what they were doing, and he brought them into Spanish Florida, and they did exactly what they were asked to do.
Within 25 years, a chain of Franciscan missions had been established, stretching from St. Augustine to what is now Parris Island in South Carolina. One of these missions was located on St. Catherine's Island. Royce Hayes is the Senior Director of Development for the island, which is now owned by the St. Catherine's Island Foundation.
Well, this was very different from what we think of the establishment of Franciscan missions in the United States. In Texas, in the American Southwest, in California, when friars came into a community of Native Americans, they came in with the army. There might be 600 soldiers with a few friars. Here on St. Catherine's, there were 300 armed men and 2 barefoot friars in funny robes. And they were able to not only establish an active congregation, but the people here built the church. It was all Indian technology. In fact, everything that went into building that church could have been found within 100 yards of it, the building materials. As Dr. Thomas says, who found the mission, these friars understood negotiation.
I've always been intrigued by the argument that the Franciscans in particular came into Spanish Florida, Georgia, and pushed the Indians around and made them do things they didn't want to do. you've got one, at most two barefoot friars in communities of 1,000 people, meaning 300 armed warriors. How could it that a friar could come in and shove these people around and get them to do something they didn't want to do? I don't think it happened. I think the friars moved in. They're part of a larger overstructure that's Spanish. But what the friars did was serve a religious role that had been in these communities for hundreds of years. They didn't compete with the hereditary political leadership. They talked about the religious part of it and largely stayed out of the politics and let powerful Indians be powerful Indians. So they fit into the fabric of what these societies had been doing for hundreds of years before the Spanish arrived. And the Franciscans, the missions were not bureaucratic places. They were traditional, native theological places.
After this success, it must have come as a shock when in October of 1597, a troubling letter arrived in St. Augustine from the friar station on what is now Cumberland Island. The Wali to the north had attacked his mission of Timunquan. The attacking Wali were driven off, but they claimed they had killed the friars stationed at missions throughout their territory. An expedition launched by the new governor of La Florida found remains of some of the missing friars, the destroyed missions and villages, but very few answers. It was not until months later that the unexpected news came that of the 6 friars in Wali territory, one, Friar Francisco de Avila, was still alive and being held captive. After his ransom, he refused to testify about his captivity or what had led to the revolt. But an interrogation of some young Wali who were captured and brought back to St. Augustine pointed to a revolt led by Don Juanillo, heir to the Wali chiefdom. Don Juanillo, a baptized Catholic, had reverted to the previous traditions of the Wali and taken a second wife at the objection of Friar Pedro de Corpa, the Franciscan assigned to the mission at Tolomato. In his anger, Don Juanillo launched a revolt that would see 5 of the Franciscan missionaries killed in an attempt to move away from the growing influence of Christianity. But who are these 5 Franciscans that we call the Georgia Martyrs? After 400 years, it would be easy to lose the humanity of this story in the details. But we have to remember that these 5 friars were real men, called to religious life and called to the priesthood, and then they volunteered for missionary work in the New World. And while they had to know that violent martyrdom might be a possibility, it was near certainty that they would never return home. Home for Friar Pedro de Corpa was Villalvilla, Spain, in what was most likely a small farming village. The stone baptismal font where he was baptized is still there in the local parish church. He volunteered for service in La Florida in 1587, when he was around 27 years old. Friar Pedro served 10 years in the region before his strong witness to Christian marriage sparked a rebellion in the village of Tolomato, near modern-day Shellman Bluff, that would end his and his brother friars' lives. One of his brother friars was Friar Blas Rodriguez. From Cuacos, Spain, he grew up near the monastery where the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had retired in 1556. Friar Blas came to La Florida in 1590, in his mid-30s, serving at a mission near Yolonia, where he shared a special connection with Friar Pedro, whose mission was close by. 2 other closely tied friars were Friar Miguel de Añón and Friar Antonio de Badajoz, who served together at Mission Santa Catalina de Guale on St. Catherine's Island. Friar Miguel had only been in La Florida for 2 years, was possibly of noble birth, and was a renowned preacher. Friar Antonio, on the other hand, was a lay Franciscan brother who in his 10 years in La Florida had mastered the Wali language. Friar Francisco de Veráscola was the only one of the 5 from the Basque region of Spain, and 33 years old at the time of his death, he was the youngest. Physically large and athletic, He was known for his gentle nature and his love of sport with the youth he served. Young and enthusiastic, he was charged with starting a new mission near the village of Asao, near what would become Darien. The Peruvian Franciscan chronicler Ore recorded that he was returning in his canoe from getting building supplies when he was attacked and killed. But perhaps the most important part of this story is that Catholicism did not die with these 5 Franciscan friars. After several years of conflict, new Franciscan friars would return to the Guale, missions would be rebuilt, and for another 80 years, natives would be baptized into the Catholic faith in coastal Georgia. Until the 1680s, though, when English allied natives launched slave raids from Charleston into Spanish-controlled territory to the south, pushing the tribes towards St. Augustine. In 1733, when the colony of Georgia was established, its charter maintained that Catholics were not allowed, because at that moment, they were scarcely 50 years from a time when thousands of Spanish allied Catholic natives lived in villages along the coast and the barrier islands. With time, Catholics would once again return to Georgia, and while still a minority, we are a thriving community, and in some places, we are still served by Franciscan friars. After the missions were abandoned in the 1680s, the structures collapsed and their locations were lost. That was until the 1980s, when a team led by Dr. Thomas found and excavated the ruins of the mission site on St. Catherine's Island.
It took us about 5 years to find Mission Santa Catalina de Wally, which sounds like a long time, but people have been looking for that sucker for 300 years. So it actually worked out pretty well. We spent 20 years excavating there, and much of it was exactly according to the Franciscan plan. The layout, the method of burial, the Franciscan order, the way they proceeded would be recognized to any Franciscan in the world. But as we looked a little closer at the archaeology, we found a bunch of disconnects. We found things that were going on that did not belong in a Franciscan life. People are supposed to be buried without grave goods. The Wali living there were loaded with grave goods. We found a number of organizational things that just didn't seem to make sense. And we've talked to the Franciscan order about this. And the thing that really made the Franciscans successful in coastal Georgia is a trait they've carried on today. Their primary mission in a mission was to save souls. And the Franciscans like to refer to themselves as amiable anarchists. That is, people who have a goal. We're going to save these souls. And along the line, if you have to break a few rules to do it, as an anarchist, you're going to do it because you are saving those souls. And we were surprised to see that in the archaeology, and it took us a long time to understand exactly what the Franciscans were doing.
Father Bill McIntyre is a Franciscan friar and pastor of St. Peter Claver Church in Macon. When asked about why the Franciscans were successful ministering to the native peoples of Georgia so long ago, he had this to say.
So I suppose 2 things happened. One, they had their own ideas coming from Europe, what it must have meant to be an indigenous person here, and then they probably had a learning curve where they began to understand what does this mean, and then how to preach the gospel. And the gospel has the contents and the container. The container could be our culture, and the content is the timeless teaching of the gospel. And the friars, from what I have read, were successful in taking off some of the containers, seeing that what was their European ideology, they didn't speak like that, in European constructs, and adapting the gospel to its timeless nature to the people here in Georgia.
Dr. Thomas's archaeological work at the mission on St. Catherine's happened to coincide with the cause of the Georgia Martyrs being submitted for possible canonization. In 2007, the cause was completed and sent to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome.
And so they become kind of heroes, Catholic heroes for us. And the fact that they came to this part of the the country, which is our diocese. And as a Franciscan bishop, I share a particular interest in their history and in coming to know them as men and as priests and brothers who have indicated to us in a very strong way the meaning of what a missionary disciple is all about. And they have evangelized this part of our diocese, and we continue to do so today. And the faith has obviously grown as a result of their presence here in the late 1500s. And so we are most grateful for them to bring the faith to this part of the country and to share it, but also to witness it and stand up for the faith, even to the point of controversy, even to the point of martyrdom. And we recognize and honor them for that wonderful example and witness that they left us.
Today, the cause of Friar Pedro de Corpa and his companions, the Georgia Martyrs, is being considered so they may be beatified, and one day, for their example of missionary discipleship and sacrifice along the Georgia coast, we could call these 5 missionary Franciscans who gave their lives 400 years ago saints.